Dave Barry's memoir is called Class Clown. It is at least his 46th book. On the front of his book, he makes an important declaration. Quote, "How I went 77 years without growing up," unquote. For 30 years, Dave Barry wrote a weekly humor column published in newspapers, mostly on the weekends. He retired that column in 2005, but has kept writing. On the back flap of his memoir, the bio says he has more bestsellers than you can count on two hands. Barry won the 1988 Pulitzer Prize for commentary. He lives in Miami. Dave Barry, I have to start off by saying years ago, unfortunately for both of us, years ago, every Sunday morning, my friends and I would read at different places your column and have to call up and say, "Did you see Dave Barry's column this morning? Did you see what he said?" And did you get feedback like that all the time when you were starting?
I did, yeah. I mean, not when I was starting. When I was starting, like, I don't think anybody was reading my column when I was starting. But yeah, it was nice to know. I've over the years gotten many emails and letters from folks, or talked to folks who said that. Often is with, like, my dad and I, we didn't agree on much, but we used to read your column, or my mom used to send me your column. So yes, I felt like I was a vehicle for some relationships.
As you know, you might not know, this podcast is usually very serious about serious books. But when we saw the opportunity to at least beg you to come on, we did. And you said yes. And you are where in California?
I'm in Beverly Hills, I believe. So, and I just want to stress that it seems to be quite peaceful here in Beverly Hills. I don't know. I just got here, though. I mean, we may have civil unrest soon. I don't plan to start any, but I'm ready for it.
Can you remember, I thought about this morning, can you remember the time in your life where you laughed the hardest over something that happened to you?
I can't remember any specific thing like that. The hard, like, just, but you know, there just have been times when I've been uncontrollably, barely able to not go to the bathroom, laughing. But most of these times involved drinking beer, or like being in college. So, like, I there's very distant memories, but not anything specific.
I just bring it up. I was with a bunch of college friends and high school friends, and one of them told a story, and the room never recovered. I mean, it went on and on for hours laughing about it. Anyway, I want to go to the last thing.
Well, thanks for sharing that story. You were no more specific than I was with your answer.
No, I don't dare tell that story.
Okay. Oh, you were trying to lure me into that. Yeah.
At the end of your book, you thank Sophie Barry, Rob, Laura, Dylan, Kyle Barry, Celia Kaufman. Above all, thanks to Michelle Kaufman, your wife, best friend, and office mate, for her steadfast assurance that this would turn out to be a good book, despite the fact that it is not The Kite Runner. Before you tell the story about The Kite Runner, what about all those people that you name? Any of them humorous?
They're all funny. These are basically my wife, my kids, my grandkids, my mother-in-law. They're all funny people. None of them are like professionally funny, which is probably a good thing. Like my son and daughter both have real jobs. My wife has a real job, but they're all pretty funny. But anyway, the story about the Kite Runner. When I say they're pretty funny, I mean that they sometimes laugh at my jokes. Oh, not always. The Kite Runner story is, my wife, Michelle Kaufman, is a very enthusiastic person. And when she likes something, she really likes it. And she loved the book, The Kite Runner. And she would not, I mean, if you knew her, this would ring true. She will not, when she's enthusiastic about something, allow you not to be enthusiastic about that thing, even if you are a complete stranger trying to go about your life. So if there was a period of months, if not years, during which time, anytime Michelle was with anybody and the subject of books came up, or even didn't necessarily come up, she would tell them they had to buy The Kite Runner. They had to read The Kite Runner. I was in bookstores with her more than once when she would just go up to people, complete strangers, and say, "Have you read The Kite Runner?" Or she'd be on a plane and she'd see people who either were reading The Kite Runner, in which case she would encourage them to continue, or just pretty much tell people at random. So anyway, that book is hugely successful. So I think I have the figure in my book. It was only like 5 million copies, maybe more, but at least 3 million of those copies were sold personally by my wife, Michelle. And I have asked her more than once, like, could you maybe make one of my books into a gigantic bestseller? But so far she's chosen not to do that for whatever reason.
Have you done a memoir of any kind before this?
No, not a proper memoir. I wrote a lot about my own life over the years when I was writing a column for many years. I mean, much of the time it was sort of like a diary of my life, but it was very much stylized. It was, I was turning things into humor columns. So a lot of the times I was exaggerating and, just using something that happened to me to take off on something else. This is the only book I've ever written where I really tried to talk about my own life and be accurate. I spent a fair amount of time, especially in the early years of writing about the early years, confirming that my memory was correct, or asking folks like my brothers and my friends, is this the way you remember this happening?
I said in the introduction, which you didn't hear, which I recorded earlier, that you are, this is at least your 46th book. I said at least because I wasn't sure. I counted it in the front. Are there more books that you didn't list in this one?
Yeah, Moby Dick. I wrote that under no. Yeah, there are a lot of books with my name on them. Some of them are collections of columns, so you really can't count those. It's like some of them are really short. None of them contain useful information. So I'm downplaying. Yes, there are a lot of books that I wrote or that are under my name. Maybe probably more than there should be. Although I'm not up there with Stephen King.
On the personal side, a couple of things that were new to me. You declared yourself a libertarian,
Yes.
not a member of either Republican or Democrat. Why a libertarian?
I think it was sort of when I started out. I was very much a lefty. My parents were both ardent Democrats, and I was, in the '60s. I marched for civil rights and protested the war in Vietnam. I think the change for me came when I went to work for a newspaper, the Daily Local News in Westchester, Pennsylvania, when I started covering government, mostly local government, in the area that the Daily Local News covered, which was Chester County, Pennsylvania. And it just slowly began to seep into my consciousness that although a lot of people were very well-meaning and who were some very dedicated, selfless public servants, a lot of them weren't. and I kept noting that the people who were the most politically ambitious seemed to be the least interested in other people. They seemed to be most interested in their own advancement and their own power and success. It just was sort of like an emotional vibe. And then I started to read more and more about it. Anyway, I don't want to get boring in the ideological weeds here, but I just gradually reached the conclusion that I was happier if I would be able to make most of the decisions about my own life for myself, that the fewer things that I had to cede the authority to people that I didn't know, but many of whom I had met, really I didn't think were smarter than me or better than me or nicer than me or more concerned about the future of the world than me. That rather than have them make decisions for me, I'd rather make them as much as possible myself. And that's pretty much my definition of libertarianism. I'm not an anarchist. I don't think there should be no government at all. I don't think people should be left to starve in the streets. I think we do have a responsibility to each other. But I really, whenever there's a choice between something that is being done for me or something that I can decide for myself what would be the best way to do it, I prefer the latter. And in that sense, I'm a libertarian.
How often?
There are things that, I'm sorry, just to continue, I disagree with both parties on a bunch of things. And I agree with both parties on a bunch of things. So I'm not super political, but that's where I lean.
How often have you in the past ever, like you do in this book, admit to being a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War?
Um, well, I mean, it doesn't come up much anymore, but back when I was getting started and first getting syndicated, and people would ask me, well, where'd you come from? I didn't hesitate to talk about it. I mean, I've never been ashamed of that. I've always thought that was the right decision. I still think that was the right decision, but it hadn't, over the years, as Vietnam drifted farther and farther into our national rearview mirror, it came up less and less. But I did feel like I should at least address it here, since it was 2 years of my life, right after I got out of college. And I was talking about how I became the humor columnist that I ultimately became. I did felt I needed to just address that.
Let's go through some of the basics you get to. Where were you born?
I was born in Armonk, New York, a little town about 30 miles or so north of New York City. When I grew up, it was a little village, 2,000 people. I literally knew everybody in that town. Very, very much small town vibe, even though we were close to New York City, and a lot of my dad, for example, worked in New York City. The Armonk is now part of the megaburbs, and it is a very prestigious. I find it hilarious, really. It's like extremely expensive to live there, and very Tony little town. It was not like that at all when I grew up.
What did your dad do, and what did your mom do back then?
My dad was a Presbyterian minister, but he did not have a parish. He was the executive director of an organization which still exists, I think, called the New York City Mission Society, which was an anti-poverty agency in New York. It ran programs for kids, ran summer camps. These are mostly kids from Harlem and the South Bronx. He was also very active in the civil rights movement at the time, and that's what he did. But he would, every day go into New York City to be the executive director of the New York City Mission Society. He also was active in churches around the city, and even out to where I live, where he would, on some Sundays, he would preach at various places. But he didn't wear his collar backward or anything like that. He wasn't Mr. Go Around preaching, and he was very relaxed about denominations. I mean, his kids, there was no Presbyterian church in Armonk, so we went to the Episcopal Church in Armonk, which the pastor there was a good friend of my dad's. He was not a big stickler for what specific religion you were, and he performed many weddings, in fact, back in the 50s and 60s, when like a Jewish kid and a Catholic kid had to get married, and neither the priest nor the rabbi would consent to that. My dad would marry them. He was like happy to do that. So that was my dad. My mom was a really interesting person. She was a child of the Depression, and actually was born and raised in a house with a sod roof in Nebraska. Her dad was a mechanic at a sugar beet factory. They didn't have a lot of money. It was the Depression. She didn't have a happy childhood. She didn't get along particularly well with her mother. As soon as she could get away, she left home, I think, when she was 16. She ended up going to the University of Nebraska, and then she went to Chicago and became a secretary. In fact, she was a secretary. She did not know this, for the Manhattan Project. She took dictation from Enrico Fermi. And we would ask her later, what did he say? She's like, I have no idea. I didn't understand anything. But that's where she met my dad, and they got married in New York. But anyway, my mom, she had a tough childhood. She had depression. She battled with depression for her entire life, and she ultimately lost the battle. She ultimately took her own life. But she was, despite that, the funniest person I ever knew. She was very funny, very edgy, very dark sense of humor. She would not take anything seriously. I mean, if there was a chance to see humor in it, she would. So I've always said, when people ask you, like, when you do what I do, you're always getting asked, where do you get your sense of humor? I got it from my mom. I mean, both my dad and my mom were funny, but and neither of them, they didn't take things too serious. They didn't. They were Midwesterners, and they did not believe in being pompous or anything like that. But my mom had that real edge to her, where she would just go for it, and no matter what. And I got that from her, and ultimately it was my career. It was just not taking things too seriously.
Did you ever worry about getting depression yourself?
No. I had a remarkably happy childhood. I mean, it's funny because my dad I talk about both of these things in the book. My dad became an alcoholic. He recovered and he spent the last 10, 15, 20 years of his life helping other people with alcoholism because he was a very good man. That's what he did. But he did have to go through that. And it was a rough time for the whole family. And my mom was a depressive person who committed suicide. So yeah, you get the short version is here's a kid raised by an alcoholic father and a mother who committed suicide. But that was not my childhood at all. They were both very funny. They were both loving. They did not inflict their problems on us kids. And so to answer your question, I never worried about it. I mean, I guess now maybe you would. I didn't, I was too young to worry about what depression was or whether you could inherit it or not. But I didn't. I was lucky and I had an excellent childhood and not mentally ill unless you count what I do for a living, which is not really sane, but.
As an interviewer, you're always looking for original questions to ask someone. And so here is my first original question for you.
I'll be the judge of that.
Where do you get your ideas?
Yeah. Costco. No. Yeah, I begin the book by talking about this very question. And a rock band of authors with a lot of famous authors. And one of them is Stephen King. And the day that the band formed in 1992, I don't think any of us knew each other. And I came into this room full of people playing instruments, and they were just god awful. We're still pretty bad, but it was a cacophony of badness. And Stephen King is one of them. He's strumming away on his guitar. And then, I pick up a guitar and start playing. And then, so I haven't met any of these people yet. I'm just starting in the room. We're just, hi, I'm Dave. I'll play. And then when we took our first break, Stephen King walked over to me. I've never met the guy. He's a big guy. And he leans down to me, and goes, "So, Dave Barry, where do you get your ideas?" And this, demonic cackle. What he was doing was making an author joke because authors get that question over and over and over. Nobody's probably been asked that question more than Stephen King has. So that was our little thing, first in joke. And that's one of the reasons that the band, we all became friends. We were so used to being asked the same stuff and, not having a good answer for it. So we could bond over that.
How many years? I think I remember 30, but you tell me how many years that you wrote that weekly column.
Well, I mean, if you start at the very beginning, when I first started writing it for the Daily Local News in Westchester, Pennsylvania, it would be about 1972. But then for years and years, it was only in the Daily Local News in Westchester, Pennsylvania. And some of those years it wasn't there. It was like, because I did other things for a while. I started writing regularly in the mid 70s, like mid to late 70s. And it started to really catch on in the early 80s, like 80s. So from the early 80s, like 81, 82 to 2005 was when I formally stopped writing my weekly humor column. So I was about 20 whatever years of syndication is about 20 to 25 years, somewhere in there. But I mean, the beginning was just a few papers. At the end, it was like 500.
Why'd you stop?
I stopped because I was just, I don't know, it felt like I've done this. And, I don't have to keep doing it. And I didn't feel like this burning. I mean, I've never been an ideological columnist. I don't have anything to say. I was just trying to entertain people. And I guess I felt a little tired of just trying to entertain people. I thought I was still good at it. But I could sort of see a time coming when I thought maybe I wouldn't be, or I'd just be too burned out and be doing it just to do it. And I didn't want to. So I had other options. I could write books. So I thought, well, I'll do that. What's weird is that after I finished this memoir, I started writing a Substack, which is, I don't know what everybody knows what a Substack is, but it's basically a blog, but you can write whatever you want. A lot of people now have Substacks. A lot of people used to be in journalism, and you can get paid to do it. You can get subscribers, but it's sort of just between you and the readers. And I started doing it again, and I really have enjoyed it. I mean, it's been like, I don't know, 4 or 5 months now, and I'm having fun doing it. It feels different though, because I don't have any deadline. I can write or not write. I don't have any length requirement. I can add graphical elements, whatever I want. And I don't have any editor telling me, so it feels kind of like the old feeling of writing a comp, trying to amuse people, but a little bit less structured and a little bit less obligatory.
Please excuse us for interrupting. We'll continue our conversation in a minute. If you go to the internet, which I'm sure you hope people do when they need to get the Substack, you have frequently asked questions about subscribing to your Substack. And the first one was, who frequently asks these questions? Answer, nobody. I'm making them up. Next question, why is it called a Substack? You say, nobody knows. Why is it called a Substack?
I do not know the answer to that. I feel almost stupid saying the word Substack because I don't really know what it means. To me, it's just a column, but there probably is an explanation. But many, many people have asked that question, and including people on Substack. Why is this called a Substack? I don't know. If somebody does want to get back to reading you every week, how much does it cost them, and how do they find it? Oh, you just type in Dave Barry Substack and you'll get there. And it asks you to subscribe, but you don't need to pay. If you just put your email address down, you're a subscriber, and you'll get it. You don't get to vote on polls, and you don't get to comment, but you can read what everybody else is reading. I don't even think you have to give your email address. I think you can just say no thanks, and you can still read it. So it's there, it's free. I feel like I'm trying to sell Ginsu knives here, but enough people choose to pay, which is, I think, lovely, that I don't need the money, but it's kind of nice that I'm getting paid to write, which is what writers do. I've really liked it. It's just kind of really direct. It's me and the readers, and there's no newspaper in between and no bureaucracy. Mr. Language Person. Who is Mr. Language Person? I created this character. It was based on William Safire's column. I don't know. William Safire for many years wrote a column for the New York Times called On Language, and he was a real stickler for proper grammar. It was brilliant, I thought, this column. And he's also a political columnist, but it was his language column that I loved. And he was, the right way to do it. And so I decided to start Mr. Language Person, who did everything wrong. He was never correct. He was the worst writing advice in the history of writing. And readers loved it. And part of the reason readers loved it was that some of them didn't get it. There's some people who would read it and this would be a column completely full of stupid statements about writing, dozens and dozens of incorrect statements, and people would tear it out, write it, and circle one of these things and say, you should do some research before call yourself a language expert because this is incorrect. Meanwhile, there's like this whole forest of other incorrect statements surrounding it. I love Mr. Language Person. That was a lot of fun. I plan to do some more Mr. Language Persons now that I have a Substack. Maybe one of the things that people ask him, Mr. Language Person, is what the hell a Substack is. But it's just one of the things. One of the things I loved about William Safire is after I started writing the Mr. Language Person column, I would get in touch with him to ask him questions, and he would always answer me. At one point, the burning issue was, does the Lone Ranger say "Hi ho Silver" away or "Hi yo Silver" away? I'll never forget. I called William. I had his number, and he would take my calls, and he would pick up the phone. Hi, was William saying hi? I said, "Hi, this is Dave Barry. Does the Lone Ranger say "Hi ho Silver" or "Hi yo Silver"? And without hesitation, he would go "Hi yo Silver." He was very. He was the authority. So I would know who's going to argue with Mr. Language Person. With William Safire about that. Over the years that you've been a humorist, when do you? I've got a whole list of quotes from you over the years, the brainy quotes, that they publish online, and it just struck me. Do you get up in the middle of the night and write those down, or do they come to you when you're sitting in front of your computer? When do those quotes come to you? Any quote? Any funny thing that you've ever written? They don't come to me when I'm sleeping.
Well, you might wake up and all of a sudden think
Oh,
of
well,
something.
yeah, that will sometimes happen, but that is not usually the process. Because then if it were the process, I would spend almost all of my time sleeping instead of only 60%, which is what I did. No, I mean, every now and then something will come to you overnight. I think everybody's familiar with this, not just writers, where it's something that's been bothering you or you're thinking about. Will somehow your brain will work on it, and then you'll give you the answer. And I have been known to wake up in the middle of the night and write something down. Uh, and and but most of it comes from staring at a screen, sometimes for hours on end with very little productive happening. Sometimes at the end of despair, like I've lost it. I've got nothing to say. This isn't funny. I'll never be funny again. I mean, I think that's sort of a normal part of the process, especially if you're a humor writer, because you can't just write something down and say, well, at least I got some words here. They have to be funny, or they're supposed to at least some pretense of being funny. And if it's not coming, it's brutal. But that's kind of the process, is sitting through a lot of not happening stuff before that stuff happens.
Here's one of your quotes. Guys are simple. Women are not simple. And they always assume that men must be just as complicated as they are, only way more mysterious. The whole point is guys are not thinking much. They are just what they appear to be, tragically.
Yes. I mean, I truly believe that to be the case. I don't, I mean, obviously it's an oversimplification, but and it's certainly not an original observation with me, but there are just less going on with guys than there is with women. I base this on, just women I've known, like especially my wife. She has way more going on in her brain on any given moment than I have going on in my brain. If we're walking, taking a walk, she has 63 things happening in her mind. And they're almost all of them coming out in one form or another as we talk. And I have like one thing going on in my mind, which is like, did I remember to close the door? It's kind of I think there's just a lot of that in male-female relationships, where women just assume we have to have the same level of complexity going on, and we don't, is my opinion.
On the back of your book, as you well know, are people saying nice things about you. But I just want to know what your reaction is when Mitch Albom says, everyone who meets Dave Barry says he's the funniest guy I know.
Well, I mean, okay, you're talking about blurbs here. Blurbs are the scandal of all scandals in the book industry. I mean, you get your friends to say nice things. Then I got to put you're going to see a blurb that says, I didn't really care for it, or I didn't even read it. And half the time, people who blurb have not read the book they're blurb. My favorite blurb, Steve Martin wrote for my previous book, which was a novel, and he wrote, "I love it. I haven't read it, but I love it." It's way more accurate blurb than most blurbs you see. But yeah, I mean, it's nice. What Mitch Albom said is very sweet. I don't know if it's true. There are probably people who would say that about me, but it's nice. It's nice, and what is he going to do? He's got to blurb my book.
He says, you're funny, you're heartfelt, tender, colorful, fascinating, and really, really funny.
Well, which one of those things do you disagree with, Brian? Just to get it out here.
Not a one of them. I must say I enjoyed
you found me to be tender, have you, over the
Absolutely. Fantastic. I must say I enjoyed the fact that Stephen King said, laugh out loud funny. And then Steve Martin said, hilarious, laugh out loud riotous. The laugh out loud thing seems to be a trend.
Because they're both named Steve. Think about it. Think that's coincidence? I don't think so.
What's the Steve Martin Oscar story?
Steve Martin, he and I are friends, and we became friends, oh God, probably 20, 30 years ago. He wrote me a fan letter, which was extremely flattering, because obviously I've always been a fan of his, but I did not know he was aware of me. And we corresponded. And then in 2003, well, actually 2002, he sent me an email, very funny email, with a word that I probably can't say even on C-SPAN. But saying, I'm going to be hosting the Oscars in next 2003, and do you want to be part of the do you want to be on a team of writers? No, F you, is what he said. Anyway, it's a funny letter. I did not do it justice just now. And email, excuse me, not letter. And so I said, sure, I'd be on his team of writers, mainly because my wife, Michelle, had read the email and saw that she would get a ticket to go to the Oscars if I said yes. And so we were going to go to the Oscars. I was going to be on the writer team. That very night she bought shoes. This is like months before the Oscars are going to happen. She went and bought a fairly expensive and extremely uncomfortable pair of shoes. So we were committed to write for the Oscars. So I go out to LA. I'm a nervous wreck because I have never done this. I've never written for anybody, let alone Steve Martin for the Oscars. And I know I'm going to be in this team of people who are, the cream of the crop of the really good comedy writers in LA do this gig. And we're going to be in a hotel room with Steve Martin, and we're going to try to come up with jokes. And the process I assumed would be that you would sit in around this room and Steve Martin would be there, and you would pitch jokes. And in my mind, the jokes would come out as like really hilarious, wonderful showbiz quips, suitable for being on this broadcast to millions of people. And that's how you would write it. And so I'm a nervous wreck because I don't have any jokes. Like, that's not how I work. I sit in a room alone, staring at a screen, gradually forming a thought into some words, and slowly forming those words into a joke, and crafting it. And I with nobody watching me, and failing over and over again. That's my process. So the idea of sitting in a room full of really smart, really funny people with Steve Martin and having to come up with jokes, it was very, very intimidating to me. And so I get to this hotel, which is somewhere right around where I am right now in Beverly Hills. And we get in this room, and they are, in fact, very, very funny people. These are really, really sharp, funny people. And there's Steve Martin, I've corresponded with, but I've never met him. So I'm very intimidated. I'm like sitting next to Steve Martin. And then the process begins, and I'm like frozen because I have no jokes, and there's banter going on, and they've all worked together. But gradually I became aware of the process, which is not what I envisioned. It's not like you just, spew out, ready, perfectly crafted jokes. It's more like somebody will say, "What about this?" And then somebody else will say, "Yeah," and then somebody else go, and some of the ideas sound funny but aren't really there yet. Some don't sound funny at all. But nobody goes, "That sucks. You're stupid. Get out of here." It's like, okay, well, they gradually build it together. They work together, and nobody's judgmental. Everybody's supportive, and they kind of form it into a joke. And then Steve Martin gets up and says something, and then you could think of another way of doing it. So it was very collaborative and very, very, supportive. Now, there are jerks, and there are people in that business who don't do it that way, who want all the credit and everything. But in this particular room, it wasn't about getting the credit. It was like, how can we make this funnier? How can we make this work? And once I got that I wasn't going to be judged if my idea wasn't perfect, then I could participate, got to know them a little bit. And I really enjoyed it. And it was wonderful to watch it all come together. And then finally the night of the show, and Steve delivers this monologue, and it's really good. And at that point I could sort of remember, okay, I helped contribute that or that, but it wasn't like that was my joke. That was, so I ended up liking it a lot. I did it one other time when he hosted in 2010 with Alec Baldwin. But that's the only other time I've done it. And it's still not what I do. I'm still like, I'm happier writing my own stuff with my name attached to it and having total control over every word, as opposed to having maybe an input into a joke that somebody else is going to deliver. But I really enjoyed the experience. I'm still friends with some of those folks, and it was fun. So
what were the I can't even talk. What were the circumstances when you were writing with the local paper in Pennsylvania that led you to go to work for the Miami Herald? What year was that?
Oh, okay. Well, there was a hiatus, not a hiatus, but there was a break between those two. I went to work for the Daily Local News in Westchester, Pennsylvania in 1971. I was hired as a general assignment reporter. I covered police and fire and wrote obituaries and all these horribly dull municipal meetings that made up a huge chunk of our coverage. I'm sure nobody read the stories. But so I worked there. I became an editor there. I really got into journalism there. Everything I know about journalism, I learned from doing that job, it was a wonderful experience. It was fun. But it was a little paper in Pennsylvania. And I thought, well, I got to, I have to move up. I have to be ambitious here. So I took a job at the Associated Press in, I think, 1975, 5 or 6, around there. Associated Press in Philadelphia, which is a much bigger name, obviously, than the Daily Local News in Westchester, Pennsylvania. But I hated it. I hated the Associated Press. It was much more regimented, much more limiting what I was allowed to do. I couldn't write any humor at all. I mean, I was writing AP style, which is very dry. Didn't like it. And so, well, I should have mentioned, while I was at the Daily Local News, I was writing a humor column. It wasn't why I was paid to be there, but I would write every week a little column. I stopped doing that when I went to the Associated Press. Hated the Associated Press. So I after a year there, I had an opportunity to leave, and a friend of mine, his father ran a company called Berger Associates, which taught effective writing seminars to business people. You go into a plant, like a DuPont plant somewhere, and you get a bunch of chemical engineers and talk to them about writing better memos and reports, that kind of thing. I knew nothing about that, but I hated the AP. And so I took that job. And so for the next 7 years, from the mid 70s until the early 80s, that's what I did. I traveled around the country teaching effective writing seminars to accountants, to engineers, to computer programmers, people who had to write a lot, but weren't really writers. And I would teach this little seminar, and how to organize, how to get to the point, how to cut your word, not be too wordy, that kind of thing. But that left me a lot of time, spare time. I was on the road, and I was in hotels and airports. So I started writing my humor column again for the Daily Local News back in Westchester, Pennsylvania, and they ran it. They ran it every week, and they paid me, I believe, $22 a week to write this weekly humor column. And by the late 70s, I was trying to see if I could expand that a little bit. That was not my job. I was still making a living teaching effective writing seminars, but I would send my column, it would clip it out of the Daily Local News, Xerox it, and send it to other newspapers. And occasionally they would run them. They'd pay me $10 or $15 and run my column. And then in the early 80s, I started getting freelance assignments from bigger papers. The main one being the Philadelphia Inquirer in Philly, and that was a pretty prestigious paper at the time. And I wrote some stuff for them, and then I wrote finally one that was the real big breakthrough one. In 1981, I wrote about natural childbirth when my son Rob was born. And it was a longer humor essay, and it just exploded. It went viral to the extent something could go viral in those days. Because I was a baby boomer having a kid, and all the editors of these newspapers had become boomers, were having kids. And so that essay was reprinted all over the place. And suddenly I had a chance to maybe leave this world of business, effective writing, and become full-time a humor writer. I'm in my 30s now, mid-30s really. And that's what happened. And the Miami Herald, they saw that one about natural childbirth and the birth of my son, and ran that. And the editor there, Gene Weingarten, from that point on, just wanted to hire me. And in 1983, the Herald hired me as a full-time humor writer. And that was it. I never had a real job ever again. I had the best job in the world. I was writing humor, really writing whatever I wanted, and getting paid for it.
Why'd you turn down Ben Bradley at the Washington Post?
That was later. After a few years at the Herald, my column was really catching on, and I was wooed. If you had told the 1970s me, who was at the Daily Local News when Watergate broke, and I was mesmerized by Woodward and Bernstein, and had read all the President's Men and saw the movie and everything. If you had told me that there was going to come a time maybe 10 years or so later, where Ben Bradley was going to woo me, was going to take me to lunch, was going to try to hire me to write humor for him, I would have said, well, of course I will do that. But when it actually happened, I didn't do it. I was really happy at the Miami Herald. They let me do anything. And I mean, I had a degree of, and they kind of, my editor down there, Gene Weingarten, was an insane person. And I mean that in a good way. He really would push for me to do stuff that was, not normal journalism stuff, real reader involvement stuff and kind of performance humor stuff. And the Washington Post, wonderful newspaper, Ben Bradley, wonderful, brilliant editor, great guy, very charming man, was offering me a job in Washington, D.C., where it was not a wild and crazy place. Journalism in Washington, it's all about politics. It's very serious. If they do like humor, Art Buchwald, if it's political humor, but not wacky, crazy, bizarre humor. And I wanted to be able to keep doing that. So as flattered as I was, and I was extremely flattered, and as insane as all my friends thought I was to turn down the Washington Post, I chose to stay at the Miami Herald and continue to be in a little bit closer to the crazy part of journalism. I never regretted that decision. I mean, I'm still in Miami and I still love it there. And I never regretted any of my time at the Miami Herald, which was they gave me all the freedom anybody could ask for.
Please excuse us for interrupting. We'll continue our conversation in a minute. I have to say, when I used to read your column on Sunday mornings in the Washington Post magazine, the kind of things that used to crack me up, and you tell the story in the book, and I want you to repeat it, is the boxes on head.
Oh, yeah. That was, yeah.
And what does that say about journalism?
Yeah, not much, not a good thing. Yeah, one of the things I love to do every 4 years for the Herald was go on the campaign trail. I would go to Iowa for the caucuses, New Hampshire for the primaries, and I would go to both political conventions. And they were just, I don't know how anybody writes seriously about American politics. Like when you get on the campaign trail and just see, how kind of like just stupid so much of our campaign, like all these ridiculously staged events where people do ridiculously staged things. What does this have to do with being president of the United States? And then the conventions are just this, well, they no longer are the big deal they were, which is because nothing ever happened at them. I mean, they were, this big, incredibly elaborate, but really basically pointless exercises where, a preordained thing happens, which is the person that we all know is going to be the candidate is nominated, and whoever he picks is his vice president. And then a whole lot of really gas-baggy speeches get made. It's just not, it's not real news. And yet so many journalists would show up for these things. Not so much now, but in the 80s, yeah. I mean, it was like still a big deal. Every newspaper sent dozens, everybody went. So the thing you're referring to was Atlanta, I believe, 1988. And Michael Dukakis was going to be nominated by the Democrats. Michael Dukakis and Lloyd Benson were the ticket. And so we're in Atlanta, and it's, everybody already knows Michael Dukakis is going to be nominated and Lloyd Benson is going to be his vice president. So there's no news. Thousands and thousands of journalists are on hand to cover this non-event. And of course, it's a lot of kabuki theater. Outside, there are protests. There are always protests. And they schedule them, and they're just so pointless. Nothing happens. Nobody's really paying attention. It's just, it's all just for show. Anyway, it just seems so dumb. And so I'm there one day, and I'm walking around outside in the designated protest area of the Democratic convention. And there's a million photographers and reporters and, covering the protests. And a woman comes walking by holding a rat. It's like a pet rat, little rat. And somebody starts, some photographer, TV guy zooms in on her. So, the other ones see that and they all scurry over, and everybody, suddenly there's all these news people are surrounding a woman with a rat. And I remember that night I'm watching TV in my Atlanta hotel, and there's the rat on television. It was like pretty early in the broadcast, the rat, because what else was happening? And I thought, this is so ridiculous that we're here, so many of us here, and that we have to cover whatever happens. So we're covering a rat. So I decided to do a little, and this is getting back to the kind of performance humor that I was talking about earlier. I enlisted the aid of two of my fellow columnists, Bob Morris of the Orlando Sentinel and Eric Lasitas of the Seattle Times. And we got boxes. Mine was like a telephone box. And we cut holes for our eyes in the front of these boxes. We went to the designated protest area and stood in a circle with our backs to each other and put our boxes over our heads. We didn't have our press credentials on. So it was just three men standing there with boxes over their heads. And you think the rat got a lot of attention. We were immediately surrounded by TV crews, radio crews, print reporters, print photographers. I later saw a photograph taken from a building showing there we are, the three of us, and then there's this mob of journalists around us, people with boxes over their heads, and they're asking us stuff like, "Well, who are you?" And we're like, "Well, we're people with boxes over our heads." And they go, "Well, what are you doing?" "Well, we're standing here with boxes on our heads." So anyway, the next day we were the lead item in the protest roundup from the Democratic convention, the people with boxes over their heads, and then pictures of us, and a whole bunch of newspapers ran pictures of the people with boxes on their heads protest. So we all write columns about this naturally because we're columnists, and basically the point of the columns was, isn't this stupid? We have nothing. We have nothing to do but cover guys with the boxes on their heads. And I got this angry reaction from other journalists. I got all these calls the next day in the Night Reader Bureau, like, why were you hoaxing the media? You hoaxed the media. And we're like, no, we didn't. We didn't hoax anybody. We had boxes on our heads, and we told you we had boxes on our heads. You're the ones who put it in the newspaper. So anyway, it was a high point, and I still am in communication with Bob Morris. In fact, just today, I got an email from him reminding me about the people with boxes on their heads protest.
Chapter 6, and this, you don't do a lot of this, but it's important to this podcast, is called Politics. And I want to read just a paragraph and get you to react to some of this. It was a serious subject, of course, but it was also highly entertaining because of the personalities on the committee, including Joe Biden, who absolutely loved to hear himself talk, Ted Kennedy, who, having had a few scandals of his own, was trying to keep a low profile, Orrin Hatch, who was hilariously prissy, Hal Heflin, who spoke very slowly. It's not what you said, but I can't repeat it. And Strom Thurmond, who spoke a language I would call unintelligible Southern. What are you referring to there? And what more would you like to say about Joe Biden, Ted Kennedy, Hal Heflin, and Strom Thurmond, and Orrin Hatch?
That was the Clarence Thomas hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee in what year was that?
91.
91. And people may not remember, older folks might remember, that absolutely riveted the country. The Clarence Thomas hearing where Anita Hill accused him of sexual impropriety. And it was such unbelievably funny television for me. I was on book tour when that happened, and almost all of my interviews were canceled because everybody was watching and talking about this. So I'm on book tour. I'm watching it along with everybody else, and I wrote that column in maybe an hour. It was one of the easier columns I have ever written because the senators, you could not parody them. They were so Joe Biden could never ever stop talking. Strom Thurmond, he would say things like, "Yeah, some go come my and I have an interpreter for him in my column, and the interpreter says, he said, someone has been coloring my hair with what appears to be Tang brand breakfast drink. And Ted Kennedy barely said anything because, of course, he had all these sexual scandals of his own. So anyway, it was hilarious. I wrote that column, as I say, I wrote it in an hour, and people loved it. Like I say, it's not hard sometimes to be a humor columnist. If you write about politics, all you have to do is sort of say what's actually happening, and it's funny to people.
Have there been things over the years that you have come to realize will always get people's funny bone? I mean, are there things that, if you had a list of the things that more than likely people are going to laugh at, what would that
Yeah,
be?
you can always make people laugh about dogs. You can always make people laugh about the difference between men and women. You can always generally, and I have been able for years because I'm old to make people laugh about the fact that I'm old. Just the things that change when you get older. Um, just sort of close to home things that everybody can experience. That's those things tend to make people laugh more than anything else. I've said this many times, but that really the essence of humor isn't so much thinking of things that nobody else thought of, although occasionally there are comedians who do that. But the most funny things usually are things that people know exactly what you mean. They just never quite saw it that way or said it that way, but they know what you mean because it's true. And the fact that, yeah, I'm sorry.
No, I just have a question. I'm sure you've never been asked ever in your life, what's the funniest column you've ever written?
Oh man,
I'm sorry
I
to
think
ask
that
that. I just had to.
it's not the funniest column I've ever written, but it's the one that kind of what it was so funny that, and the fact that I did write about it has made it resonate with people over the years. Is I wrote about this whale that got blown up in Oregon by the Oregon State. There's a dead whale washed up on a beach, and the Oregon Highway Department decided to get rid of it by blowing it up with dynamite, which doesn't sound like a great idea, and it wasn't, and it ends up raining whale guts all over all these spectators. That probably more than as the one that brought up to me more than the other. I wrote about getting a colonoscopy, and that is forever going to remain out there because people get colonoscopies and they always send each other this column. So I don't know if that's the funniest thing I ever wrote, but it's probably the most viral thing I've ever written.
Who's been the maddest at you?
Oh man, well, the Neil Diamond people. I criticize Neil Diamond, and I want to stress here that I think Neil Diamond is actually a great musician, great composer, and has written many wonderful songs. But in one of my columns, I made fun of him for the lyric where he sings, "I am, I said, to no one there, and no one heard it all, not even the chair." And my feeling was, and still is, Neil, you could have done better because obviously didn't hear you. It's a piece of furniture. So anyway, I wrote that. It was just one line in a column, but man, the Neil Diamond people didn't like that at all. I got so much mail from hate mail, seething hate mail from the Neil Diamond people. That I ended up writing another column about the hate mail, which triggered a whole lot of people who agreed with me. And, so I ended up, it went on for weeks, the Neil Diamond issue in my column. And ultimately I ended up writing a book about songs that people hate. But I think some of them are still angry at me.
What about Neil Diamond?
You know what? I don't think he took it that personally. I do know that not long after that column ran, I was watching the Today Show with Katie Couric. This is way back when Katie was there, and she was interviewing Neil Diamond. And at some point, I almost fell out of my chair. She said, well, "What about the lyric where you say no one heard it all, not even the chair?" And he starts laughing. He goes, "Yes, some guy wrote about that, and that's all." And he was laughing. So I like to think that Neil didn't take it as personally as many of his fans did.
This line in your book, I want you to speak some more about. Nobody could possibly be more cynical about our political system than our politicians.
Yes. I mean, this going back to my just talking about why I became a libertarian. The higher you rise in American politics, when you get to the level of senator, when you're running for president, these are the people who are most, I believe, least interested in you and most interested in their own careers. And not, to assume that you're being cynical because you think they're not sincere is to mistake where the real cynicism is. I'll stand by that statement. The people who achieve success, great success in American politics, are extremely cynical about how politics works and will do almost anything to become more successful in politics, as we see over and over and over again by the behavior of our political class, which is generally not impressive. So I'll stand by that. They're very cynical people, or they wouldn't be doing what they're doing.
Why did you write about former Democratic candidate for president Ruben Askew?
I way back when I first started going on the campaign trail. The Miami Herald sent me to New Hampshire with some trepidation. A lot of the serious journalists there did not like the idea of this loose cannon humor columnist representing the Miami Herald on the campaign trail. But I went, Ruben Askew was the governor of Florida, or former governor, I can't remember which, but he was running for president. And he was a perfect example of, these guys, and there are so many of them who are accomplished politically. They've done a lot. They've been elected governor. They've done this. They've been and they think that they can run for president, and they just get, their hopes get dashed on the campaign trail. And Ruben Askew was a good example of that. I remember one of my first columns when I went to New Hampshire was going to watch him campaign, which meant walking around this mall with a few aides, trying to find any voter in New Hampshire who gave a crap about Ruben Askew. It's the most humiliating experience. This man used to be the governor. He's had all these accomplishments, and nobody in New Hampshire knows who he is or cares who he is. He has no shot whatsoever. It's just an exercise in ego. So that's why I was there writing about him. I saw that over and over again, though. People would say, so-and-so has got a great shot to be the next president of the United States. And as soon as they get out there, you realize they don't have a shot. It's very mysterious who does have a shot, but so many of them don't.
Perfect moment for you years ago when Al Haig had a meet and greet in New Hampshire. Our cameras were there, and absolutely nobody showed up.
Yeah, over and over again. Alexander Haig. And he's thinking, why? I'm Alexander Haig. I'm smarter than these other people. They all know that. They are smarter than them. But it's not about smart, and it's not about what you've accomplished. It's not about achievement. It's about some mysterious thing where you connect with people or you don't. And so many of them don't once they get out there. It's sad to watch, but it's also hilarious.
The cover of this book, there you are sitting there. And I'd be interested in how much you've been involved in making this cover what it is. You're sitting there with a Davy Crockett shirt on,
and that is not a Photoshop picture. That was me in second grade. That is my picture from my Wampus Elementary School class in 1954, something like that. I had a Davy Crockett t-shirt. Davy Crockett was the king of the wild frontier. We were all madly, insanely fanatical for Davy Crockett. We all sang the Davy Crockett song. He was the first big fad that I was part of. So that's a real picture. That's really me.
And the book is called Class Clown. Was that your idea?
Yes. I picked that title right from the start, and they went along with it. I was elected class clown of the Pleasantville, New York Pleasantville High School class of 1965. Male class clown. We also had a female class clown. So
whatever happened to her?
Her name was Tony Flood, Antoinette Flood, and she was very funny. I have no idea. Tony, if you're watching this, I hope you're doing well, and I hope you're still funny.
The other thing about the class clown is the memoirs of a professional wise ass.
True. I mean, that I think that was also my idea. That's what I am. That's became my job. That's what I always was. The joke I tell is that when I was a kid and I was a wise ass in the class, I was a little bit of a discipline problem. I was the kid who always had to get the other kids to crack up, even if it was bad timing for the teacher. And I remember being told more than once by more than one teacher, that's very funny, but you can't joke your way through life, which turns out to be inaccurate. You can, in fact, joke your way through life, because that's what I ended up doing.
The other thing on the cover is New York Times best-selling author of Lessons from Lucy. I bring that up. I just suspected when I saw that might have been your best-selling book.
I honestly don't know. I think it did well. I don't know if it was the best-selling book, but it definitely was a successful book.
29 nonfiction books, 16 fiction, and then this book. What sold best, fiction, nonfiction?
Probably the nonfiction. Probably just the pure humor, I think. If you do fiction, well, this is maybe I'm just not as good at fiction as I could be. But the way to really, that I've always been told to succeed with fiction is you write a book a year. You keep, you develop that steady readership. And I never did do that. And I also don't have recurring characters, which is another thing that is said to be a good formula for fiction success. That said, I mean, there are a lot of really great fiction writers, way better than I am. And that's probably the reason that their fiction books sell so well. So,
Lucy was your dog. How long ago did Lucy die?
She died in January this year. We are still grieving over the loss of Lucy. We had her for 17 years. She was a great dog.
So of all these books, which one do you remember making the biggest impact?
That's really, I don't know. I mean, at the time, whichever one I'm talking about at the moment, but the ones that have really been around, stayed around for a long time, it's kind of weird. Like I wrote a book, The Book of Bad Songs, which, was based on it started out with the Neil Diamond book. And that book I still hear from people about. I wrote a history book called Dave Barry Slept Here a long time ago, 80s, I think. A lot of people still tell me that they still read that book. So I don't know.
Best state ever?
Best state ever. That's my state, Florida. And it was I went around visiting various tourist attractions and other kinds of sites in the state of Florida and wrote about how wonderful they are.
So I suspect that in your lifetime, young people have come up to you and said, how can I become a humorist? And if they did, what do you tell them?
I mean, if they're talking about humor writers, becoming humor writers, because I can't tell them how to become, stand-up comics, but mainly I tell them you have to do it a lot. You have to keep writing. And this is going to sound obvious, but you need to find out whether what you're writing is funny to people. A lot of people who think they're funny are not as funny as they think they are, especially in writing. Like their mom says they're funny, but the way you can tell whether you're succeeding is if people read your stuff and laugh. If they don't, it wasn't that funny. You were, so like you have to write a lot, gauge the reaction to it, see what works, get better at it. It's a slow process. And I don't think anybody just starts out being a funny writer. People start out being funny, but learning the skill of how to craft it so it's funny in print, that takes time and practice and talent. And it's talent not everybody has, but mostly the time and practice is what you need. In other words, be patient. Don't expect to just write something and then wait for fame and fortune to come your way.
We'll wrap this up, but I want to read Amy Tan's comments on the back of the book.
Amy's blurb.
Dave Barry is by far the greatest author of his generation. And I'm not just saying that because he kidnapped my dog.
See, that's a sincere blurb if I've ever heard one.
It's probably the one that'll be read.
Yep.
Dave Barry, thank you very much for your time. This book is called Class Clown. I count it as your 46th book, and there may be a lot more, but thank you very much for joining us.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Brian.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.